Welcome back, this time live and in person. It's Kit Klarenberg joining me again, this time with moving pictures all the way from Belgrade, Serbia. Kit, how are you doing today?
All mod cons. Yeah, no, I'm great. It's a gorgeously sunny day here. The temperature kind of averaging about 30. Although, in the spirit of it's quiet, too quiet, there are some dark clouds on the horizon, courtesy of the British, as ever. So yes, and this is it's been a quite remarkable 24 hours.
Well, there's a lot to get into. Main reason we wanted to get you back on was to discuss your recent piece for the Grayzone on Gladio operations and the British role within it. But rather appropriately, there is a all modern, up-to-date version of this available to us in the form of the troubles in Kosovo, which you've been commenting on. And as you're resident in the Balkans, you obviously have a keen interest in this. So why don't you explain to us what's been going on and what the hell is perfidious Albion up to in the disputed territory of Kosovo?
Okay, so this is a deeply complex matter. So I'll give you the condensed version, which is that due to the government of Kurti, he's the Kosovan Prime Minister. They have, for about a decade since the 2013 Brussels Agreement, the interaction of Serbs in North Kosovo with the mainstream Kosovo political process has been predicated on Pristina honouring certain agreements and implementing certain measures, including what's known as the ZSO, which is the like Serb municipalities, whereby the Serbs will have their own parallel police force and courts, and they will effectively be an independent statelet within a statelet, but they will be fully integrated with Kosovo's all Kosovo's political and legal structures. But the Kurti government has, in recent months, openly said the quiet part out loud, which is that we will not and never intended to do any of this. And so, as a result, Serbs in North Kosovo, because their compliance and interaction with Kosovo's politics has been predicated on honouring that agreement, they have boycotted the process. This led a few months ago to elections in North, where virtually no Serbs, if not no Serbs, actually voted, and there were mayors and other democratic office holders elected on about 100 votes by the region's small Albanian population.
Well, that's
Now,
about as good as an English council election, mate, to be honest.
Yeah, no, absolutely, all the European Parliament elections until 2019. But yes, so in effect, as a result, the EU said that the results were illegitimate. Of course, they played a massive role in ensuring that illegitimacy by doing nothing to pressure Pristina to actually honour that agreement. And then Kurti refused to back down, so in the EU and indeed the US, quite remarkably, were calling for new elections and for the honouring of the 2013 Brussels Agreement and the implementation of the ZSO. Kurti refused to play ball, and in response, the US and the EU have imposed what they call sanctions, but they are punitive measures, like not allowing Kurti or his ministers to attend EU meetings. Now, that seems fairly mild in the scheme of things, but in the context of 20 years plus, in which successive Kosovan governments have pursued an effective policy of at worst genocide of the region's Serb population, and at best just state enforced and legitimized discrimination, and the US has been completely silent on this. It's quite remarkable. I'm not sure if your viewers have ever been to Kosovo, but I strongly recommend it, because you see what a colony looks like in real time. This is somewhere where almost every street is named after a US government official. There is a very large statue of Bill Clinton next to a clothes shop titled Hillary. There are in the National Library, which is a remarkable example of brutalism, which is hated by a lot of locals, but I love it. They have a dedicated American corner with cardboard cutouts of The Rock and Sex and the City DVD box sets that you can inculcate yourself in American culture, and shops boast about the fact they sell American clothes, and there are posters everywhere saying "Thank you USA." So I mean, the fact that the US has effectively tried to rein in its pet in Kosovo is nothing short of miraculous, and all of my friends in Serbia of every political extraction, young and old, were completely bewildered by this, to the extent that they questioned whether it was real. Because it was 6 months ago it would have been unthinkable that this would happen. However, despite the US and the EU strongly condemning the Kurti government, it remains intransigent. It refuses to accept any of the the resolutions that have been put to them by Brussels and Washington. And this stirred my suspicions that there was something or someone behind Kurti encouraging them to keep escalating, to not back down. My assumption was that it was the British. I wrote about this 2 years ago, but for many years the British ran a secret psychological warfare campaign in North Kosovo to convince locals to reject Belgrade and reject the notion that they are Serbian, and adopt a Kosovo Serb identity, or get to grips with the fact they will forever be unwanted guests in a foreign country. Just as a bit of background, in Mitrovica is the kind of it's a city in the north, which is the kind of fault line, or almost like the kind of Berlin Wall separating the two parts of Kosovo, although the north is a lot smaller than the south. It has one bridge connecting the north and south of the city, which is guarded by Carabinieri, armed Italian police. The south is Albanian and the north is Serb. And then when you go over the bridge, you have to change your currency from euros into Serb dinar, and everything is written in Serb. I mean, both as a journalist and a tourist, it was a really extraordinary. I've been there several times. It's always an extraordinary experience. And on the Foreign Office website, it warns people not to go to the north, because they say that you'll be kidnapped or subject to a terrorist attack. In my experience, people are amazingly friendly and welcoming. But that's by the by. So yes, yesterday in Parliament, I believe, Alicia Kearns, who is a very spooky individual, who is a former British Ministry of Defence press officer, who then for many years was in effective charge of all of the information warfare and psychological warfare operations that were being conducted by the British in Syria. The purpose was to whitewash the brutal reality of the jihadist groups that the CIA and MI6 were supporting, and convince Syrians to, and indeed the international community, both at the kind of public and government level, to accept regime change in Syria. There was a scathing internal review of these operations, which, yes, Kearns was effectively running, which concluded that they were poorly planned, probably illegal, and cost lives. But, in the spirit of failing upwards, she was elected to Parliament in 2019 in Alan Duncan's old seat. She promptly removed, not only from her LinkedIn profile, but Google searches, any and all reference to her background working for the British government, and a welter of British intelligence cutouts like Torchlight, which teaches the government of Jordan how to use GCHQ techniques to spy on its citizens and jail dissidents, amongst other very, very dubious activities all over the Middle East and North Africa. she almost immediately she was made a member of the China Research Group, which is this very hawkish conservative party grouping, which effectively calls for all-out war on Beijing and is determined to, demonize the Chinese, however they can. So quite clearly, she was tipped for greatness. Now, she has been making a lot of noise about how we need to support, Kosovo's democratic future and, the liberalizing influence of Kurti, who is, yes, a kind of rabid nationalist of the absolute highest order. And so yesterday in Parliament, she claimed that there were arms caches had been found in the north. There is a conspiracy theory which the government of Kosovo is very keen to stoke, that there is a nexus of paramilitary terror groups in the north who act upon the orders of Belgrade and Vucic and can be activated at a moment's notice to stir up trouble. No evidence of this has ever emerged, apart from these arms caches. But I mean, given that since Kurti became leader in 2021, there has been a huge uptick in violence towards Serbs in the north. Indeed, to the extent of some young boys being shot by police over the Christmas period. It defies sense that if this nexus exists, that it wouldn't have been activated in response. And yes, there is no evidence that it has been. And now, I mean, there is that classic thing of blaming your enemy for things that you yourself are doing. The British have a history, as we're about to get into, of managing secret terrorist militias and indeed storing weapons and explosives all over target countries that can be used for this purpose. This was the strategy throughout the Cold War in Europe and probably elsewhere. It's what's known as Operation Gladio. Now, I reported on some newly declassified files from the British National Archives on Operation Gladio. I strongly suspect they were heavily weeded for anything incriminating, and there's a large amount of things, including documents related to the British component of Gladio, the kind of at-home element, which will have not ever been released and likely never will be. Now, just again, a potted history. Operation Gladio was it ran throughout the Cold War. It was run by the CIA and MI6. Its ostensible purpose was to create stay-behind armies who could, in the manner of partisans, fight off a Soviet invasion and occupation. In reality, they served to destabilize the countries in which they were posted through terrorist violence, through assassination, bank robberies, and all sorts of other incendiary activities.
Well, just to pause there for a moment, Kit. The ostensible reason for the setting up of the Gladio stay-behind armies was a fake reason, because all records released from the former Soviet Union show that the Soviet leadership, going all the way back to the Stalin era, had no plans whatsoever for an invasion of Western Europe. And it's very likely that the CIA and MI6 knew this and understood it very well. So the purpose of both Gladio and, in fact, its arguable parent organization, NATO, from the beginning, was not so much to counteract the Soviet threat of a direct military invasion, but to crush and destroy communists, socialists, radical trade unionism inside particularly places like Italy, France, Spain, Portugal, and of course, as you were saying, very secretly within Britain itself. So that's the actual purpose is not external facing, that's the public face of it. That's the public reason. The real purpose of Gladio is internal.
Yes, absolutely. And so, yes, yes, as you say, the overriding purpose was to discredit the left. So the left was blamed for a large number of these terrorist attacks that were actually carried out by fascist forces. To give you an example, and this is what broke the whole scandal open. there was a bombing in an area of Italy known as Petiano, where a car was rigged with explosives, and police were called to the scene to inspect the car, unknowing that it was set to explode. It did, and it killed several policemen and it injured several more. This was blamed on Brigada Rossi, which is the Red Brigades. It was determined at the trial, however, that every single police officer involved in investigating what happened, including an explosive expert, were tied to a far-right secret militia known as Ordine Nuovo, New Order, and the member of this group, Vincent Vigera, who carried it out, he made some disclosures at his trial that were explosive in terms of saying, well, I did this on behalf of the Italian state. And the reason that the actual perpetrators were never meant to be brought to justice is because the state cannot punish itself. And he, in later years, in a quite remarkable BBC Two Time Watch documentary on Gladio, which has never been, I mean, I urge your viewers to watch this. This is available in quite bad quality on YouTube, but it is an astonishing bit of work and very revealing. And yes, it has been, memory hold ever since. I mean, just how many people would have gotten fired as a result of its broadcast is it's probably incalculable. But yes, and he referred to this strategy of tension, which is, you were meant to attack people outside the political arena, like, women and children. And there was the 1980 Bologna train station bombing, which killed hundreds of people and injured thousands more. The purpose was to compel the public to turn to the state and sacrifice their liberty for security, to want the permanent presence of foreign soldiers in the form of NATO on Italian soil, to want enhanced surveillance measures and extensive public policing, and the perception that you're constantly being watched over for your own protection. Like, people willingly did this. Now, in the context of Italy, and this is actually ties into the origins of Gladio, Italy effectively, in the north, overthrew fascism before the war was over, and it operated thereafter effectively as a kind of anarcho-syndicalist state. There was no government, and people policed themselves. When the British and the Americans invaded Italy, they were absolutely mortified to find that this was the case. And so, and following the end of World War II, you had the left-wing and radical parties in Italy were extremely popular. And the 1948 election, there was the very real risk that the communists would win. Now, geopolitically, Italy is very important because it borders Yugoslavia, which was then, yes, going communist as well. And there was the very real risk of, I suppose, what Eisenhower would call contagion, like spreading across the region, because these were all countries ravaged by war, where left-wing forces had often on their own bat defeated Nazi and fascist forces. So the left was extremely strong, and it was necessary to systematically destroy it. But the same is the origins, as I mentioned, of Gladio are very interesting. So throughout World War II, Britain ran something called Special Operations Executive. This was it was known as the Churchill's Bastard Army. These were average people who would be trained in sabotage and kind of black bag work by MI6, and then flown into occupied Europe because Britain was incapable of invading directly. Now, they usually linked up with local resistance movements, and they carried out they blew up infrastructure and Nazi supply lines. They murdered Nazi soldiers or generals or even governors, as we'll get into. And because of Britain's much reduced military might in the wake of World War II, SOE was seized upon as a means of of carrying on Britain's work, kind of overthrowing governments they didn't like overseas, and engaging in effectively it was a shadow foreign policy that was built. And that there is an interesting kind of chicken and egg aspect to this, whereby the SOE model actually wasn't successful. It was not something that could win a war. So that's, yes, it again exposes the lie that the purpose of Gladio was to fend off a Soviet invasion. However, what SOE was very good at was causing chaos. Now, I think it was 1943, SOE conducted something called Operation Anthropoid in occupied Czechoslovakia, whereby they carried out the assassination of Heydrich, who was this absolutely brutal Nazi occupation governor of Czechoslovakia. And now it has been widely speculated that the explicit purpose of this was to provoke a massive Nazi backlash against the local population, because the British felt that the Czechs and the Slovaks were too compliant and they weren't uppity enough. Now, it was well known, because the Nazis publicized that in the event that one of their soldiers or a member of the occupation government was killed, it would result in the killing of a certain amount of locals. In Belgium, I think it was 15 for every one soldier that would be killed. 15 civilians would be murdered. In Czechoslovakia, with the Untermensch Slavic population, the gloves were totally off. So I mean, in Poland, to even give any form of assistance to a Jew was by law, occupation law, death for you and your family. Your entire family would be killed. So in Czechoslovakia, yes, the assassination of Heydrich caused a massive and extremely bloody attack on the local population by the Nazis. And yes, it has been speculated that this was the deliberate intention of the operation. Several years ago at the Czech Centre in London, I spoke to a historian about who had written a book on Anthropoid about this, and his answer suggested that he was ever so slightly worried of going in that direction. It's something that the British state would, for obvious reasons, want to conceal. Deliberately getting civilians in an allied nation killed. I mean, it's not something that the London would ever want to admit. So, but the reason I mention this is, yes, it was well understood that SOE was a wonderful way of causing chaos. And so in that context, Gladio arose from the experience of SOE. And I strongly suspect that the memory and experience of things like Operation Anthropoid and other activities was at the forefront of British planning. Now, I mentioned arms caches in North Kosovo. One of a key component of Gladio, as I mentioned, was stashing weapons and explosives all over Italy and other countries, which could then be drawn upon when these shadow terror militias wish to act. Now, in the documents I reported on for Grayzone, there is it's a very revealing kind of aid memoir that was put together by an Italian NATO representative, which documents how Gladio came to be in Italy and its origins and its formation and its operation. I mean, it's very tame, but it's still very revealing. And it mentions that many of the arms caches that were left were never recovered. Indeed, some seem to have gone missing mysteriously at the very time that they were planted. So, I mean, I strongly suspect that Britain wanted this to end up in the quote-unquote wrong hands. Again, more chaos, strategy of tension. It doesn't really matter. It's not really that concern whether this would lead to innocent civilians dying one way or another. Indeed, that was the explicit purpose of this. Now, I mean, this operated across Europe. Gladio. It is known as Operation Gladio because that is the best documented. The Italian wing of this, but similar structures existed all over NATO states, but also allegedly neutral Switzerland. Now, the Swiss were one of 3 countries, including Belgium and Italy, to actually conduct an official investigation into what was known as P26. This was the local kind of Gladio stay behind network. It produced an extensive report, which though all of the sections referring to Britain and America are largely, if not completely, redacted. But not only that, it was published in French and never translated into English. And then that is the case, 30 years later, it's never been translated into English. But there were some interesting disclosures from that probe relevant to London, which is that the British intelligence had a much more complete view of what P26 was doing than Switzerland's own government. The Swiss government had no idea what it was up to because it was being directly run by the British. In Belgium, yes, there was likewise an official investigation, which has never been translated into English, but it's and also I have spoken to some researchers I know in Belgium who say that it is a total whitewash farce, because there was a spate of, I mean, it's just absolutely horrific. They were known as the Crazy Brabant Killers. This was a group of people who would burst into supermarkets and open fire indiscriminately on people inside, including children, and then they would steal goods worth about 100 quid. Like, there was no financial purpose to these robberies at all. In several cases, it seemed that the police could have caught these people, but they somehow didn't. I mean, there were instances of police cars being parked outside and the police watching these people make a getaway and make no effort to apprehend them or chase them. Very bizarre. And it is strongly speculated that these were Gladio operatives. And this was part of the strategy attention. There is an individual in that Gladio documentary who was part of the Belgian, was confirmed to be part of the Belgian stay behind army, who alleges that he was once tasked with completing intelligence reports on supermarkets. I mean, which is a very bizarre thing. He would just go in and say, well, here's where the doors are, and here's where the back room is, and blah 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 blah. And he didn't know why he was tasked with doing this, but he did it anyway because it was orders. Here we see how the intelligence services operate via cutouts. You can have 100 people involved in a connivance, but only 2 of them actually know the full picture. And so, yes, I mean that's quite compelling. When this was exposed in 1990, it was a huge scandal. It is quite amazing to go back over the Guardian's coverage of this at the time. There's some really excellent reporting on how British operatives trained members of the stay behind armies in Britain, and how explosives used in various terror attacks were supplied by MI6 and the CIA. But this has all been forgotten. I mean, indeed, it would probably be dismissed as a ludicrous conspiracy theory now. But this was all an entirely uncontroversial matter of public record. The full dimensions of this we do not know. Some of the most interesting aspects of the newly declassified files show that Britain, at the very least, had intimate high-level knowledge of a variety of events related to what was known in Italy as the years of lead, that they never discussed publicly, and indeed have never been disclosed before by, say, Italian media. I mean, my article caused something of a sensation in Italy, which I'm very happy about, but and has been translated by some activists that I know. But there's also a reference to how an Italian official who had admitted publicly that he had known of Gladio since 1966, when he was a defense minister, he asked the British, and it seemingly this resulted from him being ordered by a judge to testify about his knowledge of Gladio. He requested that the Foreign Office disclose records relating to British quote-unquote stay behind measures in Italy in 1964. This was the year of what was known as piano solo. this was a proposed coup that was germinating to prevent Aldo Moro, who was a Christian Democrat, but very much left-leaning and willing and eager to bring socialist parties into the fold of the Italian government, which was anathema to Gladio, of course, and the CIA and MI6. And so kind of rumors of this swirled throughout 1964. And in effect, what would have happened was someone would operating for Gladio would attempt to kidnap Moro and then deliberately fudge it so it failed. Excuse me. And then upon capture, he would claim that he was directed to do it by communists, which would lead to the seizure and shutdown of a variety of left-wing publications, the capture of every leading left-winger in the country, and their imprisonment in Sardinia at a site owned by P2. We'll get into them in more detail in due course. But this was a Masonic lodge that effectively acted as a shadow government in Italy for decades, and was embedded in the CIA. Now, quite what would have happened to them there, that's up to the imagination. Although I'm sure it wouldn't have been very pleasant. And this would have led to, yes, the overall takeover of Italy by a right with far right cabal. This didn't actually come to pass, and then Moro was became prime minister without incident that year, and then governed until 1968. It was officially investigated at the time, but the findings were not released until the Gladio scandal broke many decades later. So I think the fact that a senior Italian government official who'd been in the loop for decades by that point was rather anxiously asking the Foreign Office for records related to stay-behind activities by London that year, that strongly implies that Britain was behind this. So I mentioned P2. Now, this is just, there's so many aspects of the Gladio story. It's like, in Peep Show, where they're like, do you think that we're the bad? No, sorry, Mitchell and Webb, where it's like they're dressed as Nazis. It's like, do you think we might be the baddies? Like, just we're going to blow up a train station, kill loads of people, and blame it on some communists. Are we not the ones at fault here, really? P2, it was run by Lucio Gelli, who was this kind of Italian industrialist, very well connected, and yes, an out-and-out fascist. He had a very close relationship with the US government, to the extent that he was a special guest at the inauguration ceremonies of I think it was Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, and yes, he was Ronald Reagan's personal guest at his inauguration. And the subsequent investigations showed that Henry Kissinger personally handpicked people from NATO to be part of P2, and its membership list, which was released due to eventual police investigations into their activities, which led to a welter of very mysterious deaths of people involved. Just a coincidence, I'm sure. It would read like a who's who of bankers, politicians, spooks, high-ranking military officers from within and without Italy. And it's like, this is the smoke-filled room of conspiracy. One of its members was Silvio Berlusconi, who ran, he was a media oligarch, as it were, and he died recently and took many secrets to the grave with him, I'm sure. Just as a side note, I think that Italy's experience of this, but also the knowledge that these secret structures exist and they are what drives politics and events and influence perceptions. There is a movie called Videocracy, which is about Berlusconi's media empire in Italy and how he uses it for his own malign ends. This was hugely popular outside Italy, but in Italy itself, people thought it was a bit of a damp squib. They were just like, well, it's not telling us anything we don't know. It's not very informative. And I think that they're just more that if you look at polls, the belief that the CIA and MI6 have a hand in Italian politics today, and the belief that conspiracies quote unquote do happen is very high in Italy, because they lived through it for decades. This was a daily reality for them that people were vaguely aware of, and then has been repeatedly exposed as having been the case since. It's similar actually in Serbia, but the wider Balkans too. Frequently I am accused of being a spy. Some of my neighbors refer to me as James Bond, because for decades this was a MI6 and CIA playground. They were behind. They were behind. They ran politicians. They ran their own business networks. They were involved in infiltrating pro and anti-government groups. There are insinuations they were behind some assassinations even that occurred in recent Serbian history. They certainly seemed US and British officials certainly seemed actively happy about this, at the time. And so, the residents of the West Balkans are under no illusions that this kind of stuff happens all the time, and that there is a hidden hand, influencing and guiding things. To the extent that the belief that 9/11, couldn't have been. There is a widespread belief here that, in my experience, that 9/11 could only have been an inside job. There's no way that it was that the CIA wasn't somehow involved. But anyway, that's a tangent. So we'll get back on track. But yes, P2 was one of and was just one of several kind of shadow government networks. Gelli, the leader, had been specifically tasked by the CIA with ensuring that Italy never went communist, and he was very committed to that goal. Now, in 1978, you have the kidnap of Aldo Moro, the aforementioned, he was en route at the time in a kind of an armored guard, with armed guards in a motorcade heading towards Parliament for a meeting with high-level parliamentarians, where he was going to give his blessing to a coalition government that would include the communists. Now, this is verboten. And I think that he was explicitly warned by Henry Kissinger that, well, if you sign off on this, it will be the death of you. And Moro, because he was a patriot through and through, was like, well, I'm not going to allow myself to be bullied and threatened. And then yes, Kissinger's prediction came to pass. In effect, so he was kidnapped. His guards were killed by the Red, well, ostensibly the Red Brigades, and he was held for many weeks, during which time he issued several statements, and the Red Brigade said that we will execute Moro unless you release our compatriots from your dungeons. Several of their members have been, and it seems very much falsely, accused of a variety of attacks that were actually tied to Gladio, and had ended up imprisoned as a result. And then when it became clear that they were not going to negotiate, let alone make any trades tomorrow, he was stuffed in the boot of the car and then shot many times. That his body was left, in that car for authorities to find by a river. Now, speculation and theorizing about what happened has abounded ever since. There is a very credible suggestion that the Red Brigades had been explicitly infiltrated and pushed to carry out very brutal, incendiary acts themselves, rather than getting Gladio to fit them up for crimes they didn't commit, to actually get them to commit crimes, which in order to justify crackdowns on the left and discredit them amongst the public, and inaugurate a kind of far-right authoritarian government in Italy. You might argue that's kind of what came to pass as a result of this. But at the very least, it's very clear that they could have probably gotten Moro out, and that he was thrown to the wolves, because there was this sense of ostensibly that we don't negotiate with terrorists. The British records on this are absolutely fascinating, and they talk about how the entire crisis committee, again, this is just like, it's almost comic, right? The entire crisis committee that was created to track down Moro was comprised of people who were part of P2. And it's like, and it's almost unbelievable. And the author, again, the entire note is very interesting. It's written by a British diplomat, and it's very very punchy and kind of, I think he even mentions at one point that I'm sure Frederick Forsyth will be writing about this or whatnot, but it kind of reads a bit like a thriller novel. And he mentions how, yes, it would be entirely unsurprising if this committee deliberately set out to not find Moro, let alone rescue him one way or another. So there's that aspect to it. But that's never been disclosed publicly, and it is just discussed almost axiomatically in internal communications. And it suggests that London knew a lot more about what happened than they were letting on. Whether that was just knowledge of it from handling Gladio operatives isn't clear. Whether that amounts to British involvement one way or another, that's far from clear, and that's not a claim that I am making. However, it does raise the obvious questions are raised by this, and I think that it has relevance to the present day because we are constantly told, eye roll, that that the Americans don't actually know what the Ukrainians are planning. And we don't have that insight into their operational plans or their activities. I mean, pull the other one. They're both their September counteroffensive and indeed the current counteroffensive, which seems to be going very badly, and it's just resulting in the deaths of maybe 1,000 Ukrainians a day. Without they've been lambed to slaughter without air cover. Even the mainstream media is openly acknowledging that this is a complete disaster. That they were planned, down to the most minute detail by the Americans. In direct conjunction with Kiev. So you see photos of US generals with maps in front of them and their Ukrainian opposite numbers. It defies sense. But I mean, that gives a level of plausible deniability to things like the murder of Daria Dugin, strikes or such as the Nord Stream 2 pipeline attack, the Kerch Bridge bombing, and it allows the Americans to say, well, hey, we didn't approve of this and we wouldn't have done. I mean, the toing and froing over Nord Stream is quite remarkable. I mean, ever since Cy Hirsch published an expose, which I remain somewhat skeptical about for reasons that we've previously discussed. But it is the least worst explanation there is so far. We've gone in the wake of that report. The New York Times said, well, it's not really in anyone's interest to get to the truth, but Cy Hirsch is wrong anyway. There have been numerous attacks on Hirsch and his narrative. There have been some kind of quite clear limited hangouts where it seems that elements of the Ukrainian government have been blamed for this. I mean, General Zelensky, who is probably the most likely candidate to replace Zelensky in a military coup if things go even worse, which there is on the battlefield, which there is a high degree of possibility, if not probability of. It was claimed a few weeks back that he ran this secret cell of commandos who rented a private boat and went into this area of the sea without anyone knowing or noticing. I mean, just that area of the Baltics, it would be entirely unsurprising if the CIA is aware when somebody sneezes on a fishing vessel there. It is heavily it is a sea of massive geopolitical significance, bordered by both very close allies and hostile states, as it were. So of course it's going to be heavily monitored and policed. It's completely ludicrous, on its face, that some people rented a small boat and then with laser-like precision managed to strike both Nord Stream pipelines, which the US and indeed Britain had been expressing a desire to destroy, even if just in terms of tearing up the deal for many years prior. I mean, there is an aspect of this whereby I think that it wouldn't be surprising if the US actually doesn't know about some of the stuff that Ukraine is getting up to. And indeed, in the matter of Kosovo, the Ukrainians are being guided by Britain. And so, I mean, at the end of last year, we at the Grayzone published a series of reports relevant to Britain's covert contribution to the proxy war. This was some of the stuff I was grilled about in my stop by counter-terror police when I returned to the UK in May.
Thus confirming the story, really.
Yes, thus confirming the authenticity of all of all of our reporting and the documents we received. But in effect, yes, that was a string of reports which documented Britain's planning and involvement in the Kerch Bridge bombing, their construction of a secret partisan terror army on behalf of the Odessa SBU, and also the operation by Ukrainian forces and security and intelligence services, courtesy of London, of Anomaly 6, which is a tracking, a kind of global surveillance and monitoring software, which is the company behind it, Anomaly 6. They are very shady and very shadowy, and there are numerous references in the documents to how they are terrified of public exposure, and indeed they know that what they're doing is legal under many kind of international and national data protection agreements and laws. Now, I speculated at the time that Anomaly 6's technology was being used to track Daria Dugin, or perhaps Dugin himself. Their software is not actually as precise as they like to claim it is. I speculated it was used in the attack on Russian officials in Donbass, and indeed, and perhaps could have even played a role in the Kerch Bridge bombing, where notifying the SBU where the driver was. So they could detonate the bomb, on the bridge. There are references in other documents which we are yet to report on to Anomaly 6's technology being used to monitor the movements and indeed statements publicly and privately of Ukraine's quote-unquote pro-Russia contingent. Now, both in the occupied and formerly occupied parts of Ukraine, and indeed in even in Western Ukraine, there have been countless cases of people being charged with treason or for quote-unquote collaboration. Like, you receive someone who took a loaf of bread from a Russian soldier in Kherson, is facing 20 years in jail. Someone who posted an anti-Zelensky meme on social media or had a conversation with a relative in Russia is facing like 10 years for undermining the state. Now, it would be entirely unsurprising. I mean, and there's also the fact that the people have been around in following the counteroffensive. People were rounded up and killed, in the formerly occupied areas. Bucha, where as we discussed when I was last on, which is deeply mysterious. What happened and precisely how all of these people died or allegedly died, and it seems that at the very least, some of the people who were killed, they were found near the food supplies that had been provided by Russian soldiers. So I mean, whether they were killed for accepting aid by the Azov cleanup unit, which avowedly went into the city, and then suddenly you get all of these reports of bodies in the street, after this cleanup team arrives. Was Anomaly 6's software used to identify these people? As we discussed when I was last on, Britain played a key role in the Bucha psyop. I mean, even if we accept that all of these people were killed by the Russians, I mean, who were, under the terms of a recently signed peace agreement, peacefully retreating from the area, quite why they would carry out a massacre, and therefore run the risk of sabotaging this deal isn't clear. But it was Boris Johnson who flew out at that time to Ukraine and told Zelensky, we don't want you to accept this peace deal, we want you to keep fighting and we will support you. But not only that, Boris Johnson was also the first source to claim what happened in Bucha was a genocide, and that the war in Ukraine is one of genocide being waged by Russia against the general Ukrainian population. This is a war that has civilian casualties of around 15,000, it's calculated, which is about how many people were dying a week in Iraq at the height of the occupation. So I mean, but and yes, there was a Defense Intelligence Agency official who openly spoke about publicly about the Bucha effect and how Bucha had effectively ruined any hope of a negotiated settlement and a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. Now, Britain, as I revealed last time, was and remains heavily involved in policing narratives online about what happened in Bucha, and indeed they were the first country on the scene. I think it was Lukashenko claimed that he had proof that it was that what happened in Bucha was a British special forces operation. I mean, he's not provided any evidence for that, but I mean, at the very least, it would be Britain was heavily involved in marketing this publicly. Now, if we factor in the fact that anomaly 6 technology might have been used to track people down and lead to their deaths, that is a whole other layer of complicity, which is deeply disturbing, and also from the perspective of the British state, deeply worrying. Now, we might have discussed this last time, but in further confirmation of the authenticity of our reporting, I think the Defence and Security Media Advisory Committee, which is a MOD and MI5 and MI6 run press censorship mechanism. They issue the famous D notices, but actually, their primary role is to meet with and consult with editors and journalists of major newspapers and websites in the UK to tell them how certain matters related to national security can be reported on and how they can be reported on. In the minutes of their most recent meeting, which I think was in April, this covered the 6-month period from November to April. There was a kind of a discussion from a senior British military official who was part of this, who I think he's the Deputy Secretary of the DSMA, where he said, the last months of 2012, there were stories published during that time, and we consulted with journalists at that time on matters the most sensitive I've ever seen, since I started running the DSMA. Now, this is the exact period that we published all of these stories related to Britain's involvement in the Ukraine proxy war. I strongly suspect, if not am fairly certain, that's what they were referring to. And I think that that we the stories that we published, because we made the decision to affix the underlying documents so people could review them for themselves, on British plans to blow up Kerch Bridge, etc. Those reports got picked up by media all over the world, English and non-English language, on every continent. And we fielded a lot of requests from journalists who were very interested in doing stuff on this. There was zero pickup in Britain, and I strongly suspect that some journalists would have thought, oh well, I'm going to cover this. And they spoke to the GSMA, and they were told, do not go anywhere near this. And so again, that just it reinforces the authenticity of what we reported and our reporting. But it's also quite frightening, because yes, that was no doubt one of the reasons that I was stopped, because Britain is dedicated to maintaining a very specific narrative of the Ukrainian war, what is happening, how it started, and why. And it has been Britain all along since. I mean, during the Obama administration, Barack Obama was committed to a doctrine that stated that Ukraine is not a core US interest. It is a core interest of Russia, though. Therefore, we shouldn't be stirring up trouble there. We should just be, privatizing the country for our own profit. But, not pushing for NATO membership or arming Azov or, the kind of the constellation of fascist, outright fascist groups in the country. Now, during the same period, there were senior officials like Chris Donnelly, who is an old bête noire of mine, who was central to the Kerch Bridge, planning of the Kerch Bridge bombing and the construction of this partisan army, who for years, even before Maidan, was coordinating with far-right fascist forces in Ukraine, and rabidly anti-Russian elements, within the military, within the intelligence services, within every kind of organ of the state, as it were. And so, in more recent communications with a very senior British military official, he openly talks about how we need to counter US caution on this. Biden is completely insane for worrying about this spilling out into nuclear war. We need to keep on ratcheting up, escalate, keep poking the bear, and show the Russians that we mean business, because all they understand is force, because of course they're these backward savages, and blah blah blah. So I mean, given that the war is now, it could well end abruptly, because just purely because of the sheer scale of the Ukrainian losses. I mean, they're on route to lose 1 million people by the end of the year, by some calculations that I've seen. It's complete. It's even the New York Times is. I mean, it was absolutely horrendous. The report on how the even in cities that are unscathed by the war, by and large, like Lviv or Lvov, whatever you want to call it, in the West, former Bandera's stamping grounds anyway, where they've recently torn down Russian Orthodox churches horrifically. A large proportion of the local population has been killed, and they are multiple funerals every single day, and they're having to dig up the graves of World War I and II veterans, some of whom fought fascism, ironically, to make way for new bodies. Mothers are losing their sons in their 20s and 30s who, attended top local universities, got great grades, and were on course to become, a doctor or a scientist, or, insert valuable, important profession. And they're in pieces about it. I saw some research recently from a Ukrainian pollster, which found that 78% of Ukrainians report a close friend or relative having died in this war. And it's just like, if there's a genocide, it's coming from, I mean, this was exactly a point that was made. There was a recent Vice documentary where a nameless Ukrainian soldier said, if I understand the Ukrainian government's plans correctly, it is to annihilate our country's 18 to 30-year-old population.
Which is exactly what's happening.
Yeah, exactly. Like, if there's a genocide, it is being, drawn up and executed by Zelensky and his backers in the US and Britain.
Well, let's just pause there for a moment, Kit, because I wanted to just jump back to the British plan here for Ukraine in particular, because we've talked about this before. You mentioned in our discussion here about the British plan to unleash chaos. Now, part of the war planning for Ukraine, which the British people, secret operatives like Donnelly and others would have had in mind, it seems, is that if we cause enough problems for the Russians, either on the battlefield or via terrorism, then there will be instability break out in Russia, and Putin gets dumped, or there's a coup, or the whole thing just implodes. The whole government just implodes. And they don't really care what comes afterwards as long as it implodes. With that in mind, and this, we're getting in slightly into the realm of speculation here, what do you think would be the likelihood of British involvement in the Prigozhin events? Because that seems to be exactly what the likes of Chris Donnelly and others like him would have been looking for. I mean, it's almost as, I mean, they've been writing about this in their state-aligned media in Britain, like the Telegraph and others, which has extensive links to the intelligence agencies, speculating that Prigozhin was going to do something for months and months beforehand, and then he finally makes this move. So it seems to be exactly what these shady characters wanted. So what do you, I mean, it is, we are speculating a little bit, but what is the likelihood of their at least having knowledge of this or some kind of hand within it?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting because as far as I can tell, based on, I mean, I have spoken to, friends of mine, within Russia who are not all of them Russian, about what happened, and it very much seems that Prigozhin well understood that there was no hope of success. I mean, he pitched up in at every stage he was being told as they traveled along, by the way, you are surrounded by however many tens of thousands of Chechens and and other soldiers, and I mean his 2 trucks and 2 tanks of like a few hundred people were never ever going to be able to take Moscow. The fact that he carried on with this, I mean, there is the explanation that he was completely insane or desperate. He does seem to have been, motivated to do this because he was losing his business, which was the one, the very lucrative aspect of his wider empire. But but by its subsumation into the Russian armed forces. However, another explanation is that yes, that he had someone backing him. Again, we see shades of Kurti here. And I think that the fact that this was obviously the major media focus was on Prigozhin, but the fact that this was happening at a time where there's all of this toing and froing going on in Kosovo is very interesting to me. The British have wanted a second front in the Balkans since the start of this. They have been pushing for it. I've written about how in Bosnia they were involved in changing the country's voting system. They pressured Bosnia's High Commissioner to change the country's voting system after votes had been cast, a move which they knew was going to lead to calls for secession within Republika Srpska, and that's exactly what happened. And as a result, they have stationed a large number of quote-unquote peacekeepers in Bosnia who are, in my experience, hated by the local population. They don't want them there. There are bars that say, "We do not serve soldiers," and while they play Yugoslav era music very loudly, it's a beautiful sight. But to get back to Prigozhin, I think that they no doubt the British were hoping that there would be that this would at the very least produce chaos. Whether they're involved is a different matter. Although yes, Prigozhin's total belligerence and total insanity in doing this, it does tend to suggest that there was something or someone telling him that they had his back. Now there are almost, in a sense, shades of the Forest Brothers, which was run. This was the parallel to Gladio, a secret fascist terror army that operated in the Baltic states and was comprised of members of the Waffen SS and other Nazi collaborationists, or the Kurted soldiers in Poland, again, who were anti-Nazi but anti-communist, that were run by the British, who were carrying out all of this sabotage against the Red Army and the Soviet quote-unquote occupation authorities, in the belief that the British and the Americans were one day going to come and save them. And
they never do.
And they never did. And I think that yes, there is that aspect to it, because I mean, in terms of the soldiers he had available to him, and indeed the material and vehicles and equipment, he was never ever going to be able to enact another battle of Moscow on his own. It was interesting to see the profusion of like British commentators and British journalists who were all in for Prigozhin, having spent months talking him up as a kind of Hitler-like figure, and indeed talking up Wagner as this useless bunch of zombies who just walked into enemy fire, and then suddenly he is this crusading force for good with this highly effective army that can actually overthrow the government of Russia with less than 30,000 people available to them. That that was quite interesting, and it would suggest there was some kind of coordination on messaging. The Russian government has spoken of investigating potential foreign links to this. But yes, the fact that the CIA seemed to have known about it in advance, the idea that advances were not made to him, even in a very surreptitious nudge, wink, wink way, which in itself is very British. They might have seen he might have been given reason to believe that he would have backing, and then as the day progressed, he realized that beyond some lunatics on Twitter, no one was taking it seriously. I mean, Russians certainly didn't take it very seriously, and I gathered that that there was a flurry of internet searches for who is Prigozhin in Russia after this happened, and indeed it's severely damaged his public image, to the extent that he was known. And I mean, even Politico published a remarkably sober article on this, basically saying that it is complete fantasy to suggest that this has in any way weakened Putin whatsoever. And we know for a fact that the Ukrainian armed forces did use this as an opportunity, saw this as a potential opportunity to exploit Russian weaknesses on the front, and then found out to their fatal cost in many cases that this was that nothing had changed. But this is precisely the kind of insanity that populates the minds of people like Chris Donnelly. Now, you mentioned that the people the people who want the breakup of Russia or the fall of Putin are not concerned about what happens next. Indeed, there was a British parliamentary committee, the Defence Committee investigated the question of Russia implications for British foreign policy and defence. I think it was in 2018. At this time, Donnelly was an advisor to the Defence Committee and chose its witnesses, the people that heard evidence from, and the experts that they got in to consult on matters. That report's implications for British defence by Russia. Every single contributor to its report, everyone that was consulted on and submitted written evidence or indeed gave presentations to the committee parliamentarians directly, was tied to the Institute for Statecraft or Integrity Initiative. And so they would be handpicked by Donnelly to push the committee in a particular direction. So many of them spoke of how we shouldn't worry about a post-Putin Russia and everything be fine and dandy. Therefore, we should support regime change. Therefore, we should not see him as a figure of stability. I mean, and I think that Putin is a pink-eyed liberal compared to some of the people, both within the ranks of the country's right wing, but also its armed forces, its intelligence services, and indeed the Communist Party. Like one of because it doesn't fit the narrative, we don't hear about this. The communists in Russia have been pushing Putin, pushing for intervention in Ukraine for years. And have openly stated it was a betrayal of our people to not do so earlier. There are many within. It seems there are many within the Russian establishment who think that Putin is still fighting with kid gloves in Ukraine. They could do a lot more because they are using a tiny fraction of their military. And I even saw some people, again British commentators eerily, who thought that the Prigozhin seizing power would mean the end of the war. This is someone who is. His criticisms are that they don't have enough weapons and they're not killing enough people. They're not engaging in enough destruction. He has criticised the government for not bombing cities in the west of Ukraine. Whoever replaced Putin was going to be a lot more brutal, but in terms of the prosecution of this, and indeed if it was someone from Navalny's clique, would be potentially outright fascist in terms of domestic policy as well. So I mean, yes, be careful what you wish for.
Well, I don't think they actually care to some extent. But the other thing is, of course, as some more serious academics have pointed out, Putin sits at the center of at least 4 factions within the Kremlin and the wider Russian state. which he keeps in balance constantly. So the idea of him as this all-powerful dictator is false.
Oh,
He's
yes.
essentially a chairman of a
Oh, yeah.
series of committees and a series of factions which he has to keep, which he has to cater to. And that's why the war policy is as it is. Whereas Prigozhin, I mean, he made a number of contradictory statements, some of which agreed with Ukrainian propaganda at certain points. So I think the British idea seems to be, well, it doesn't matter if this guy stages some sort of a failed coup, as long as the chaos gets unleashed and essentially the Russian state then implodes, then we're winning, essentially. And if there's, you know, a nuclear explosion in the middle of Russia, or, you know, the Russian state just implodes, or we get to send it back to the pre-Mongol invasion era, well, then that's all for the better, because then it's easy for the British vulture to pick over the carcass, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like, this is something I didn't even know about. But you know, like my dear friend Jeff Kay, who does some superb work on the history of Western chemical and biological warfare, and has been looking into the biolabs in Ukraine. He's excellent. Please do follow him on Twitter, everyone, because you're just a fascinating font of information and a really nice guy to boot. But he recently posted a thread on Twitter on how all of Russia's during the invasion of Russia by Britain and America, but also a great number of other countries following the Russian Revolution. They were obviously seeking to, in the words of Churchill, strangle Bolshevism in the cradle. I didn't know this extended to the various resources in different parts of Russia being carved up in advance. It was like the Berlin Conference with Africa, or that scene in Godfather 2 with the cake of Cuba. They were just like, right, well, the British will get like the oil and the minerals here, and then the Americans will get this. Like, and this thinking has not changed. Like, you know, since then, they tried to do this in the 90s and the early 2000s via other means, you know, via privatization, via vulture capitalism. You know, it hasn't worked. And another thing as well that I think is really ironic. One of the reasons that the sanctions on Russia have not worked is because Russian oligarchs and indeed just Russians in general have all moved their wealth back to Russia. And it's being invested in projects in Russia. Now, this is something that Putin has wanted since he first became president in 2000. And you know, oligarchs stubbornly refused to play ball. You know, and you know, now he's gotten what he's long wanted. And I think that also it cuts to one of the core contradictions of all of the kind of anti-Russian hysteria that kind of got us into this mess, that's been peddled by Integrity Initiative and indeed Byline Times. The editor of Byline Times, an absolutely odious individual named Peter Jukes, in a debate with Matt Kennard of Declassified UK on Russian interference. He got mopped the floor with in a very embarrassing fashion. I urge people to check it out. I think it was convened by Novara Media following the release of the Russia report, which Chris Donnelly was a major contributor to, as was Christopher Steele. But yes, anyway, he acknowledges that there is a contradiction because the whole narrative is that, well, you know, Russia seeks to destabilize other countries in order to protect its oligarchs abroad, and so they can, you know, make and store their money abroad. But like, that doesn't make any sense, because like, Jukes even admits, yes, it appears to be contradictory. Yeah, it's completely contradictory, because you know, you don't want, if you are concerned with protecting your wealth overseas, you don't want political or any form of instability. I mean, you know, in Latin America, you know, like it was very common for you know, criminals, particularly in the drug trade, many of them tied to the CIA, coincidentally, to, you know, conceal their wealth in local banks. In the event of a coup, this would usually be seized, whether, like, you know, one way or another. So like, you don't want instability, but also, yes, the Russian government for a very long time has not wanted oligarchs to do this. So why they would have why they would dedicate their intelligence services to protecting these people and their interests overseas and their wealth overseas, that defies sense. But anyway, again, that's by the by. But I think it speaks to the fact that, yes, that all of these people, these kind of alleged Russia experts who are heavily influencing government policy. I mean, that we know for a fact that the British are, in their own words, pressuring the US to keep going on this. Despite the fact that it's becoming, just politically and economically unsustainable. I mean, at least in the sense that people that it is becoming a very popular rallying cry in the US. That we're allowing our country to descend to Victorian levels in terms of infrastructure and poverty. And yet we're sending, billions and billions and billions to Ukraine with no end in sight, and to very little apparent gain beyond killing Russians, which the US has US officials have openly stated they are very happy about and they've wanted for a very long time. But yeah, I mean, so we know that Britain's pushing the US to keep escalating, and they're doing so because they strongly believe that Russia is a paper tiger that will eventually bend, and that there is no risk of a conflict between the US and Russia, and there's no risk of a nuclear exchange. There quite clearly is. But I think that this notion that Russia can't or won't escalate further has been amply demonstrated after the wake of every incendiary escalation, like the Kerch Bridge bombing, which produced which the Ukrainians initially were cheering and posting videos of happy birthday, Marilyn Monroe singing "Happy Birthday, Mr. President" because it occurred on Putin's birthday, to then complaining about the genocidal bombing of their cities, which was launched in response, or what they claim to be genocidal, but only targeted infrastructure. With very few civilian casualties. And so, these people keep on getting presented with the reality that they are wrong, and their entire analysis of the nature of Russia and its military and its leadership is wrong, but they just keep on doing the same thing. And because they're convinced that they're right, and one day, yes, they will finally get the balkanization of Russia, and they will finally, unseat dastardly Putin. It's frightening. And I think that, yes, just to bring things full circle, as I say, the British have wanted a second front in the war since they started. I have been worried about that happening here, specifically in respect to Kosovo. This is nearly 18 months now. This has been a kind of perpetual worry of mine. I've been keeping a very close eye on what's happening. They can't, indeed shouldn't be allowed to get away with this. And I think that, yes, I mean, if it kind of behooves anyone on the anti-imperialist, anti-war left who's very serious about preventing World War III to publicize what Britain is doing here. Again, we haven't yet had false flag terror attacks or mass shootings perpetrated by Kosovo Albanians to be blamed on the Serbs, but I strongly suspect, particularly given this arms cachet was found, that it's only a matter of time.
This is the old game of British imperialism continues, which is, as we said about the Prigozhin events, it doesn't matter if it's just chaos as long as it's serving the overall interest, which is that if Serbia can be bombed again, they'll see that as weakening Russia. If there's some kind of war breaks out, doesn't matter if the Kosovan Albanians are thrown into a meat grinder either, fundamentally. Just as it doesn't matter to them if their old friends, the Kurds in Syria and Turkey, get sacrificed, or hundreds of thousands or millions of Ukrainians end up dead, as long as the city of London and the British ruling class are sat at the top of the pile of skulls when the whole thing's done. That's all that matters. So what needs to be understood is that all the rhetoric about Kosovo and the Balkans, which is, we're about securing stability and, state building, none of that ever mattered. It was all about, well, first of all, breaking up the old socialist system, then making sure that what replaced it was wholly under the control of either US or British imperialism or some partnership between the two, ideally shutting out the Germans and the French if they possibly could. And now it's all about, of course, trying to complicate the situation with regard to the Ukraine war and the Russian Federation. So again, they don't care how many Kosovans die, how many Serbs die, what kind of hell they unleash in the place. And they don't care now any more than they cared 100 years ago. about the same areas of the world, to be quite blunt about it. Kit, before we finish off here, did you have anything else that you wanted to add to the Gladio story, or anything else that you wanted to point people in the direction of?
Well, yeah, I mean, just to leave things on a relatively optimistic note, because I mean it's been quite bleak, our discussion. I mean, I think that yes, that like Gladio, as horrific as it was, it actually reflected British imperial decline, because no longer could they send their navy overseas to engage in gunboat diplomacy. The SOE model, which was also applied to covert operations, failed very, very quickly. For instance, in Albania, an attempted overthrow of the communist government of Enver Hoxha there was run along SOE lines for several years, and it failed spectacularly. If this had been 30 years earlier, the British could have just very easily removed whoever was leading the country. They couldn't do that anymore. And I think that, yes, that what we're seeing now in kind of Britain's flaccid yet nonetheless still dangerous attempts to create a second front in the Balkans is that they know, and this has been core to British thinking since the early 1940s, before the Second World War was over, that Britain's relevance and power is completely contingent on not only the American empire's endurance, but its ability to steer the empire in ways that benefit Britain. And I think that the fact that this is engaging in all sorts of, it's going around the world starting fires in the hope that the US will either extinguish the blaze or pour more petrol on it, according to their, according to British interests in a particular context. Yes, this is the kind of the death rattle. Britain is pushing the US to keep escalating in Ukraine, because it knows that the US will come out, and indeed NATO, which is another lifeline for British imperialism, will come out of it severely weakened. But this is almost inevitable at this time, and I strongly suspect that the US will, maybe sooner than we think, decide that it's high time to throw Zelensky or under the bus, so to speak. And irrespective of what Britain is doing and saying, secretly and behind closed doors. And yes, I mean, we see the potential de-escalation of tensions between the US and China. The UK has been rabidly pushing anti-China hysteria, has been, talking of outright conflict with China, supports a belligerent Western stance on China, is the only country, apart from maybe Lithuania, in Europe that's been, stupid enough to go fully along with the US's, impossible project of total decoupling from China, much to its own detriment. Other European countries, they've either engaged in rhetoric or they've, imposed some measures. They haven't gone along with the whole welter of proposals. Britain has, and it's failed miserably. So, I think that we are seeing in Ukraine, in all of this horror that the British fomented, the kind of the last gasp of Britain's post-empire delusion. And hopefully we, in the manner of Yemen, for example, where as I recently revealed for the Cradle, the British intelligence was involved in running psychological operations in order to get people to reject the Houthis and accept a UN brokered quote-unquote peace deal that would require effective total surrender before the bombing stopped and the blockade was lifted. But then, along came China and, brokered a peace without anyone expecting it, and it caught the CIA by surprise, because it offered both sides deals and encouraged constructive dialogue based on mutual benefit. And suddenly the long-running Iran-Saudi conflict, which has been the source of, or the cause of, you know, an enormous amount of instability and death and destruction in West Asia for, you know, 20 years or more, suddenly no longer exists. And I hope that this will play out in every other corner of the world. I mean, China may indeed you know, play a role in brokering a peace in Ukraine. They are actually, you know, they supply a lot of the material for, you know, the weapons that are used that are made by Raytheon, etc. So, you know, they could turn off that tap at any time. But also, I think that Zelensky, because he probably fears on some level that he's going to be abandoned by the US, and the peace that could, you know, the negotiated settlement that could follow could be very brutal. And you know, I mean, the Bosnians, as I mentioned before, they were encouraged to reject negotiations for years, and then had a peace that was far worse than every other Yugoslav or UN or EU brokered peace deal, which they previously rejected. And in their own words, they signed this peace agreement with a gun to their heads, with the threat of financial and, you know, all other aid being taken away from them by the US if they didn't accept it. I think that Zelensky can foresee potentially something similar happening in Ukraine, and might get a better deal by siding with the Chinese than going the US route. And so maybe he's hedging his bets there. So yeah, I mean, as I say, I sincerely hope, I might be very wrong, but I sincerely hope that, like, we are running out of road here, and the war will finally be over before the end of the year, perhaps. But I mean, by making that optimistic forecast, I probably elongated the conflict by several years, so I'll stop talking. But
Wow.
But yes, it's been a pleasure, Alex. God bless you, my friend.
As always, Kit, thank you for coming on, and we'll link to the Gladio piece in the show description. But until next time, Kit Klarenberg, all the way from Belgrade, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.